Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. You're very welcome. My name is Don Morrow, and I'm head of dairying here at CAFRE. And I'd just like to welcome you to the first of three weekly webinars we're running in partnership with the Ulster Farmers Union and the Dairy Council of Northern Ireland. We're dealing with some challenges currently or likely to impact on dairy farms in Northern Ireland in the near future. And these challenges are climate change and future legislation, becoming more sustainable in feeding and managing our herds. And finally, we'll be covering staffing dairy farms to effectively meet all these and the other challenges profitably. We'll be recording tonight's event, and it will be available through our website on CAFRE TV later, and that can be accessed through the CAFRE website, but it usually takes about a week or so before we can get that edited and up. Tonight's webinar is an introduction to the topic of greenhouse gas emissions. In a week which includes the opening of the COP26 and following the Minister's announcement of the Soil Nutrient Health Scheme, we felt it would be useful to explain the basics of greenhouse gases and carbon, give it a background to the legislation, which gases are considered greenhouse gases, where they're emitted during the dairy farming process. We'll also look at the process of calculating a carbon footprint for a dairy farm and the main factors that affect that final emission figure. Now, obviously, this is only one side of the story, with the other being the uptake of carbon or sequestration, and being the other side. To be honest, we won't be able to cover that aspect in this 1 hour webinar, but we are working on further webinars to explain these aspects later. We just felt it would be good to get through the basics of the process in this initial webinar. There's a list there of our speakers tonight, and those speakers will then be on our panel at the end of the event to answer some questions. So first of all, to start, I'm going to ask Dr. Mike Johnson, Chief Executive of the Dairy Council for Northern Ireland, one of our partners in this event, to introduce the topic and to set the scene. And then after that, each of our two presenters will speak for about 20 minutes each, which should allow us to have about 20 minutes at the end for questions. Now, in terms of asking questions, you will have the opportunity throughout this event to submit questions. If you're using a computer or a laptop, you can submit these questions using the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. If you're using a mobile or a tablet, you can access the Q&A option via the three-dot icon, which appears when you tap your screen. Please submit your questions using the all panelist option, and we will try to answer as many of these questions at the end of the event. Now, in practice, what we tend to find is that folk tend to ask the questions at the very end of the event, which makes it very difficult sometimes for us to cover them all. So if you have a question as you go through, please put it up there as soon as you can. So first of all, then, if I can ask Dr. Mike Johnson, to set the scene for us. Over to you, Mike.
Thanks, Don, and good evening, everyone. The dairy sector's commitment to working more sustainably can be demonstrated by improvements already achieved over the past 3 decades, during which time we've reduced the carbon intensity of a litre of milk by more than a third. And we're continuing to improve by investing throughout the supply chain to further reduce emissions, to improve our efficiency of energy usage, and to reduce our use of fossil fuels. Even though we've done a lot and achieved much, our journey still has a long, long way to go, and it will be a journey that will not be without pain. We'll have to continue to invest on farms and in processing plants to improve efficiencies and reduce emissions, and we'll have to be open to changing the ways in which we produce milk. So let me map out the drivers that will influence our journey over the next 30 years. The work that MLAs and the Northern Ireland Assembly are doing now and putting in place legislation will have a massive influence. It's our hope that they'll put in place legislation that will allow the Northern Ireland agri-food sector to continue to produce high quality food that customers and consumers at home and around the world want to buy and consume, while meeting realistic environmental targets that are evidence-based. But in addition to legislation, our customers are taking an active interest in climate change. And this is a double-edged sword, since on one hand, it's good that this interest is being reflected in positive engagement with our supply chain. But what we're finding is that we're being pulled in different directions by different customers. And at the moment, this is happening in a vacuum without legislative targets to act as a benchmark. So we need our customers to work with us, but we need the leadership that only legislation can provide. The third factor that will impact our journey is the actions of our competitors. Increasingly, environmental criteria are part of the proposition to customers and consumers to buy and consume products from particular countries and companies. We need to make sure that our environmental credentials are not only as good as our competitors, but we also need to recognize that we have an opportunity to invest in our supply chain to create areas of environmental competitive advantage. But we cannot undertake this journey over the next 30 years on our own. We need to undertake it in particular with partnership with government and research. We need active collaboration across government, industry, and research to create the knowledge we'll need to continue to reduce emissions, and that will also create opportunities to establish Northern Ireland as a world leader in dealing with climate change while meeting the demand from a growing global population for high quality and safe food. The generation that started farming in the pre-war years could arguably claim that no other generation has seen the amount of change in farming that they have lived through. The changes how they have experienced have been many, enormous, and have had very significant impacts on how food is produced. And indeed, when I think back when I entered the dairy industry 3, 4 decades ago, mobile phones were still a thing of science fiction. So changes we have lived through and adapted to have been driven by massive changes in technology, by research that has pushed the boundaries of our knowledge about farming, and by the need to improve efficiency and productivity. Not only is the pace of change unlikely to decrease, but the language around farming is also changing. So farmers now need to know about sequestration, carbon calculators, biogenic emissions, carbon equivalents, much, much more. The time of sustainable dairy farming is here. It's here to stay. But it's not something that we should be wary of. In fact, we should embrace it, because if farming businesses are efficient, they will have lower emissions. So we're at the start of another significant period of change in the way milk is produced on Northern Ireland dairy farms. There will be a learning curve for everyone, and the sooner everyone starts, the better. One of the areas of managing a dairy farming business that will change is around data collection, data analysis, and its use in business decisions. In essence, if you don't measure, you can't manage. And in terms of the sustainability journey that we're now on, it's not enough just to do things differently and in a more sustainable way. The effect of changing farming practices and investments will have to be demonstrated. And the only way to do that is to collect data over time. So more detailed data collection will become the norm for all dairy farming businesses. And dairy farmers will need training to assist with this, and importantly, to enable them to make maximum use of this data to improve the efficiency of their farming businesses. That we have a vibrant dairy sector in Northern Ireland is testament to the ability of our dairy farming families over generations to adapt, to change, and to grasp the opportunities it brings. The environmental targets that we will have to meet over the next 30 years will be challenging. But with the right legislative framework and with strong collaboration between industry, government, and research, I know that we can continue to reduce emissions and continue to improve biodiversity on dairy farms while continuing to produce high quality milk. How can I be so confident? Well, because we have a strong track record of being able to adapt to change, and because I know the ability of our dairy farmers. So finally, can I commend CAFRE and the Ulster Farmers Union for organising this and the subsequent webinars to help raise awareness of what will be involved in producing milk in a more sustainable way well into the future. Thanks, Don.
Thanks, Mike. And as I said, Mike will be on the panel at the end of this event to take any questions that you have for him. If I move on then to our next speaker, and this is Alethea Brown. Alethea is a senior technologist working in the Sustainable Land Management branch of CAFRE, and her work translates the latest research findings through a range of knowledge and technology transfer projects to make a positive impact on Northern Ireland farm businesses. Most recently, her work has focused on demonstrating the use of greenhouse gas calculators to measure a farm carbon footprint, along with identifying mitigation strategies that each farm can take to reduce their overall greenhouse gas emissions while still maintaining production and profitability. Tonight, Alethea is going to give an explanation of this process. And so, if without any further ado, can I ask you, Alethea, to begin your presentation, please?
Yeah, well, thank you, Dawn, and thanks for inviting me along this evening. So yes, as Dawn was saying, I work as a technologist here at CAFRE, and tonight I'm going to provide a bit of an introduction to carbon and an overview of climate change. So just a list here of what I'm going to go through this evening. I'm going to talk about the relevant greenhouse gases when it comes to the dairy enterprise, and what those greenhouse gases, how they contribute to climate change and what climate change is. I'm then going to talk about the importance of a farm carbon footprint and our Northern Ireland agricultural greenhouse gas emissions and targets. And then finally, as Dawn was saying, my main role is a technologist. I have been looking at carbon calculators here at CAFRE, so I've done some investigation into those, and I'm going to provide you with a bit of an overview of the work that I've been involved in there. So if I begin then with the three relevant greenhouse gases when it comes to agriculture and then the dairy enterprise. So they are carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. So carbon dioxide is what is classed as a long-lived greenhouse gas. It can stay in our atmosphere from around 300 to 1,000 years before it breaks down. Carbon dioxide arises on farm following the burning of fossil fuels to produce energy for electric and heat of our farm buildings, and then also through the combustion of fuel for farm vehicles. Carbon dioxide also arises on farm through the manufacturing and production of feed and fertilizer. So those two products that are bought and brought onto the farm, there are a lot of carbon dioxide emissions associated with them before they even reach the farm gate. So if I move on then to methane, methane is what is classed as a short-lived greenhouse gas. It has a global warming potential of 28, which basically means it is 28 times better at trapping the sun's heat than carbon dioxide. Methane arises on farm through the enteric fermentation process in the rumen of the animals. That digestive process releases methane emissions through the mouth of the animal. There are also methane emissions associated with the manure management system used on farm. So time spent in-house will have more methane emissions than time at grass. And then finally, our third greenhouse gas then is nitrous oxide. So nitrous oxide is also classed as a long-lived greenhouse gas. It can stay in our atmosphere for around 115 years. It is extremely potent and has a global warming potential of 265. So it's really good at trapping the sun's heat. So nitrous oxide arises on farm following the application of our fertilizers onto the soil. So your purchase fertilizer and the manures. So the nitrogen within the fertilizer will react with soil microbes and go through a process of denitrification and nitrification, and that releases nitrous oxide emissions from the soils. So these are the three gases that we need to be, I suppose, considering when we're measuring a carbon footprint. So someone once asked me, what does 1 tonne of carbon dioxide look like? So I retrieved this picture, and hopefully it just gives a good explanation or a good illustration of what 1 tonne of carbon dioxide looks like. And it's really just to highlight there that to sequester 1,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide, you would need to plant 1,000 hectares of woodland, or around 247 acres of woodland. So what do these greenhouse gases actually do? So they build up in our atmosphere and trap the sun's heat. So typically our sun's rays would come in and a proportion would stay and a proportion would escape out of the atmosphere. But what is happening is these greenhouse gases are creating this coat across the atmosphere, and though that proportion that should have escaped out of the atmosphere is being trapped by the greenhouse gases. And this is heating up the surface of the earth, and that is what is causing the changes in our weather patterns and extreme weather events. So what are these extreme weather events? We are experiencing a lot more heat waves, drought conditions, flooding, storms, and wildfire. And these all contribute to or have a significant impact on our farm business. So not only does agriculture, release emissions and contribute to climate change, we are also significantly impacted by climate change. So this can lead to the loss of crop or livestock on our farms due to the different climatic conditions. We could have biodiversity displacement with some species migrating to warmer climates or cooler climates, and also could introduce new pests and diseases on farm. And ultimately, this could have an impact on the farm profitability and the productivity of the business. So this was a diagram I thought was actually quite good to show the climate change is actually happening here in Northern Ireland. So it's called #ShowYourStripes, and it was created by a man named Ed Hawking from the University of Reading. And it is the warming stripes in Northern Ireland from 1884 to 2019. And each bar within this diagram represents the annual average temperature here in Northern Ireland. And the blue temperatures are obviously cooler temperatures, and the red bars are hotter temperatures. And as you can see from around 1990 in Northern Ireland here, we have been experiencing hotter temperatures, annual average temperatures. And not only are they hotter, but the frequency of these have increased in the past 20 years. So what is carbon footprint, and why is it so important? A carbon footprint is the total greenhouse gas emissions caused by an individual, an organisation, a service, or a product. It is calculated within a given year. So here at CAFRE, we measure our carbon footprint within the calendar year, and it is expressed as a carbon dioxide equivalent. So carbon dioxide equivalent is the metric measure that is used to compare the emissions between different greenhouse gases based on their global warming potential. And it's important to measure our carbon footprint because it does give us an understanding of where our greenhouse gas emissions come from. So the source of our emissions, the quantity of those emissions, and then what we can do is put measures in place to reduce those emissions. It is also good for farm business sustainability, so to ensure your farm business is having no impact on the environment and you're protecting your business for future. It can also be good in terms of marketing your food product to show that you have taken steps to measure your carbon footprint and reduce your emissions on farm. And then also in terms of slowing the rate of climate change. So our temperature rises of 2 degrees have long been regarded as the gateway to dangerous warming. But more recently, our scientists and policymakers have argued that limiting temperature rise to 1.5 degrees is safer. And the reason for that is if we don't limit our temperature rise to 1.5 degrees, we will increase the frequency and intensity of the extreme weather events that I was just talking about. So this diagram is taken from our Northern Ireland Greenhouse Gas Inventory Report, which is released every year. And this is taken from the 2021 inventory report, although the data is dated 2019, that's included in the report. And it really just shows that agriculture's contribution to Northern Ireland's total greenhouse gas emissions, it sits at 26%. And that's actually down 1% from the previous year, where it was sitting at 27%. But there is another sector within this that I really wanted to highlight tonight, and that's the land use change and forestry sector. And it's just really to highlight that some of our farmland is actually included within this sector, and it would include both sources and sinks in terms of emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. So our current agriculture targets and strategies here in Northern Ireland. So we only have one target, the UK net zero target by 2050, that was brought into law in June 2019 by the UK government. And we are waiting, as Mike was saying, on our climate change bills that are going through the Assembly currently here at Northern Ireland. And I'm not going to go into these at all in detail, but just really to highlight the Northern Ireland Private Members Bill, climate change bill that has a net zero target by 2045. And then our own DAERA climate change bill, which has 82% reduction in emissions by 2050. And then finally, I wanted to talk about the Efficient Farming Cuts Greenhouse Gas Implementation Plan. So this is a practical plan that we use here at CAFRE, and we advise our farmers to use as well. The plan is focused on encouraging the implementation of a series of on-farm efficiency measures, which can improve farm performance and reduce the carbon intensity of food production. So it covers these 4 themes here, you can see, and it is a good practical document that you can use to identify good mitigation measures covering nutrient use efficiency, land management, livestock management, energy efficiency and renewables. So in the next presentation that Michaela is going to deliver, she's going to go into these mitigation measures in detail and give you a good indication of what you can do on farm to reduce emissions. And then, as Dawn was saying, my primary role is a technologist here in CAFRE, and over the past number of years, I have really focused on investigating carbon calculators. And to do this, I had to try and select a calculator that could best suit our farm systems here in Northern Ireland. I needed to set a list of criteria, and this is the list you see here. I wanted to select a calculator that was based on science, that was comprehensive and was practical to use on farm. A calculator that conformed to the IPCC Tier 2 calculations for livestock. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they would set the emission factors associated with specific farming activity. And a Tier 1 calculator would be based on default figures, and a Tier 2 calculator would be country-specific figures, emission factors. So we wanted a Tier 2 calculator. Tier 2 calculators also request for more farm data and therefore provide a more accurate carbon footprint of the farm. We also wanted a calculator that was PAS 2050 accredited, which basically means applies the standard for measuring a carbon footprint. And then a calculator that measured whole farm emissions and not just by enterprise or by product. And that was really due to the mixed farm systems we have here in Northern Ireland. An additional criteria that we looked at was we wanted a calculator that could evolve with the science. And we all know carbon sequestration is not there yet. And also our method for measuring methane emissions, the GWP star method, is not there yet, or it hasn't been released for us to use. So we wanted a calculator that could keep up with the science. And based on this list of criteria, I just move to the next slide. These are the carbon calculators that I suppose we investigated in depth, and they are all good calculators. They all have their pros and their cons, but I suppose just based on that criteria I have talked about in the previous slide, we selected AgriCalc, and we've been using AgriCalc here at CAFRE to measure our own farm carbon footprint, and also we are using it as part of our environmental business development group program, carbon program. So if anyone does want any advice on using any of these calculators, just contact one of your CAFRE advisors.
We've had quite a number of questions in here, so I will take one or two if you don't mind. And the first one is in relation to that inventory slide you brought up. If agriculture is responsible for 26% of CO2 emissions, does this take into account the amount of CO2 removed from the environment by growing crops, trees, hedges, etc. on farm?
Within that diagram, the sector that had the land use change in forestry, that does actually take into account carbon sequestration from soils, hedges and trees. Currently, at the moment, we are emitting more than we are sequestering, and that was, I suppose, within that sector is mainly our wetlands and our peatlands. There's a lot of emissions coming from that, but I suppose in future, when our data is updated within that sector, you know, there should be more, I suppose, there could be more accurate data, I suppose, informing the inventory going forward. And then, yeah, in terms of sequestration, yes.
Yeah. So that 26% is plus the other land use section is taken account of sequestration as we know it at the moment.
Yes, as we know it at the moment, it does take into account sequestration. Yes.
Right. Well, we're keeping well to time, and we'll try and continue that. So we'll move on then to our second speaker, who is Michaela Tanner. Michaela is a technologist within the CAFRE Sustainable Land Management branch as well. Michaela's current role focuses on the coordination and calculation of the CAFRE farm carbon footprint and identifying opportunities for carbon reduction on the campus farm. She's also been involved in the setup of carbon benchmarking programs for environmental business development groups, demonstrating the use of these calculators as a tool to manage carbon. And as part of her current role, she also reviews research to identify any potential technology that could be adopted on farms to reduce carbon emissions, and in doing so supports the delivery of our knowledge transfer programs. And so tonight, just Michaela is going to focus on outlining how the calculators work and some examples of the results from those calculators. So Michaela, thank you, and over to you.
Thanks, Dawn. Again, my name is Michaela Tanner, and as Dawn's highlighted, I'm a technologist working within the Sustainable Land Management branch. Can I thank Dawn and his team for the invitation to speak here this evening? So I suppose points what we're going to cover, as Dawn has pointed out, we're going to firstly look at data required to complete a carbon footprint, the breakdown of emissions for a typical dairy enterprise to give an example of some of the information we can get back from our carbon footprint reports, the current carbon mitigation strategies that we can put in place on farm today to make improvements within our carbon emissions on farm, and then the potential of future technologies that are in research or possibly very near completion at research stage, and the opportunity that they have to reduce carbon emissions going forward. So first of all, we're going to look at the data required to complete a carbon footprint. And as Alethea has highlighted previously, carbon footprint is the total greenhouse gas emissions caused by a farm or sector within a given year, expressed as a CO2 equivalent, carbon dioxide equivalent. In our case, we will be looking at it in terms of a whole farm, so it will be tons of carbon dioxide equivalent produced on that farm. There may be some of the calculators also break it down per product, and for a dairy enterprise that would be kilograms of milk, so kilograms of CO2 equivalent per kilogram of milk produced. So as Alethea highlighted, there's numerous different calculators out there, and there will be slightly different variations in the data required. But from the information that we have available to us, we have summarised the main inputs for these calculators. So in terms of the first area that we would look at in terms of information we would collect on farm, for those of you that complete CAFRE financial benchmarking, you would be familiar with a lot of this information. And if you ever get the opportunity, it would be a small opportunity or a small additional area of data that you would need in order to complete a carbon benchmark. So as we can see here, the first area on the left-hand side is our farm inputs. So that details our concentrate feed. So that will be both the tonnage of feed and the type of feed. For example, if it's a dairy ration or a heifer rearing ration, any purchased crops or forage, for example, any silage or whole crop potentially is brought into the farm. Type of fertilizer and the quantity of fertilizer, lime if it's applied and where it's applied. The use of organic manure, so if we have production of organic manures on the farm, where we're using them, so that will go into our land use section now in a wee minute, or if we're importing any additional organic manures as well. Crop protection products, so that would be for anybody that is producing any homegrown cereals on their farm. There is information collected regarding that. The use of fuel. The use of fuel on farm in terms of for agricultural activities, or if we are maybe drying grain or something like that. Electricity then, so that we would record electricity both from fossil fuel sources and if there is renewable sources or electricity produced on farm. Bedding, so that would be purchased again on the farm, and use of maybe straw from an arable enterprise then could also be recorded. And then any purchased stock would also be recorded as part of that data process. So within the land use and the livestock section that we move on to now in the middle, we look at basically the farmed area of the farm, the type of land, so whether it's grazing areas or silage areas, or as I mentioned previously, potentially arable crops or other forage crops as well. So within that, we would include information like the area, the percentage of crop utilisation, the total tonnage of silage produced off the silage areas, and also then we can allocate a land use percentage to a specific enterprise. For example, the dairy enterprise would have 60% of the land area, a beef enterprise 40%, and potentially a sheep enterprise that has 10% of the land of the farm under its control. So following on from that, then we look at our livestock management, and we first of all start with our total numbers of livestock on the farm. So that will be your average number generally across a year in a 12-month period. So following on from that, then we would collect information on the average weight of those livestock, which has an impact on the level of emissions from each livestock category. Other information then in terms of livestock would be followed by performance. So for our dairy cows, that would be calving percentage. Our heifers would be age at first calving. And then any young stock on the farm, it would be an average daily live weight gain would be required for that. These figures all play into the total calculations of our total emissions. So as much information and as accurately recorded as possible has the most benefit in terms of giving you an accurate reflection of what is actually happening on your farm today. And that is a very important point. Carbon footprint is only a snapshot of what has happened within that given year. And in order to make long-term trend, or to draw long-term trends and put in long-term plans, it's necessary to repeat it. We would generally suggest repeating it on a 2 to 3 year basis, due to the fact that any of the mitigation strategies that we will point out later on generally take a period of time before you'll actually get the impact of those within your production system. So finally then, in terms of our livestock, then we also look at our livestock outputs, which are on the right hand side. Organic manures is one of them, and I suppose Alethea had highlighted percentage time in the house. So there is an opportunity to record how long animals spend at grass. And then within the housing period, the type of housing would be very important in terms of whether it's scraped solid floors, slats, or a straw-based system. So all that will have an impact on the level of emissions from that manure management system. Farm outputs then in terms of livestock sales, so both live sales or dead sales to the factory. In a dairy enterprise, our milk sales, and then we're also recording our average percentage butter, fat and protein as well, so that we can create our fat protein corrected milk that at the end of the calculation we can compare with other farms within that calculator's scope. Other opportunities to record other outputs include silage or crop sales, and then any exported organic manures that are moved elsewhere. It is important to note as well, mortality is recorded as part of the carbon footprinting process, and the fact that if an animal passes away or dies on your farm, the emissions are still associated with your farm business during that calculation period. So some of the typical figures that we would see from a dairy farm. So as Alethea had highlighted, we have our 3 main gases that are applicable to agriculture, with, as we would expect, methane making up the large majority of our emissions on a typical dairy farm. This methane is coming from our ruminant digestion and also our manure management, as Alethea pointed out. Our nitrous oxide making up about 20% of our emissions, coming from our fertiliser and our manure management, and again our carbon dioxide coming from our manufacture and transport of both fertiliser, feed, and then the use of any fossil fuels or energy used on the farm. But more importantly, the next slide, we're going to look at specifically the sources of emissions on a typical dairy farm. So, as we've highlighted there, enteric fermentation makes up the vast majority of our emissions, accounting for over 38%. Manure management accounting for 20% of our emissions. Fertiliser in this instance accounting for 11%. Purchased feed, so this will account for both concentrate feeds and if there's any additional purchased forages, accounting for 26%. Purchased bedding is shown at 0%, but it's two decimal places, so it's a very small proportion in this instance. Fuel making up 2%, electricity 1%, and other 1%. The other category includes the use of lime or any of our mortality, as well as any of our farm plastic waste. So that's all included in this section. Now, depending on the enterprise, there may be a shift in the breakdown of these emissions. For example, there may be an increase in fertiliser emissions and a reduction in emissions from feed if there is additional grass grown potentially. But this is a typical breakdown across a range of production systems. But ultimately, this just highlights where we can focus our opportunities to make improvements. Alethea had highlighted this slide earlier, but this is our best available information and technology that we have to hand at this present moment in time. And this has been developed and is presented very clearly as part of the Greenhouse Gas Implementation Plan pulled together by DERA. So, as we pointed out, I'm going to go through in detail each of these 4 sections, looking firstly at manure management, nutrient management, land management, livestock management, and then finally energy efficiency and renewable energies. So, in order to improve our nutrient management, we need to look at efficient nutrient management being the main point of this slide. So how do we do that? Well, we look at our nutrient management planning. How can we make the most efficient use of our slurries? We apply them using our low emission slurry spreading equipment through LESA. This increases obviously reduces our ammonia emissions and increases the nitrogen available to our grass or our crops. The timing of our application, both of fertilizer and slurries, we should focus on applying these in spring when the nitrogen is again reduced in ammonia and nitrous oxide emissions and is more available to our plants. This application of organic manure also has financial benefit in terms of reduced fertilizer requirement, and with fertilizer prices at the minute, this will be very important going forward. If we are considering or do require the use of additional chemical fertilizers, for example, for areas of silage ground potentially, the use of stabilized fertilizers is preferable. The use of urea over CAN is initially preferable, followed by protected urea being the gold standard. This reduces the amount of nitrogen that is lost to the atmosphere as both ammonia and nitrous oxide, and therefore you're getting more value from the nitrogen that you're purchasing and getting the added benefit with growing your grass. So in terms of if you're thinking, okay, fertilizer, have enough, potentially you have the opportunity to look at increasing natural nitrogen fixation within your swards through the use of clover or potentially other sward mixes such as multi-species swards. This increases our natural nitrogen from the atmosphere, which is fixed by rhizobia bacteria in the soil, and which is then transformed into nitrates, which is available to our plants. Again, we have a number of benefits from all of these actions, and I've only listed some of them here. It's not an exhaustive list, but as Alethea highly pointed out, and Mike has mentioned previously, where we can be sustainable in terms of carbon, we have many benefits in terms of improved profitability of our farm businesses. And nutrient use efficiency is one main area that we can make improvements on, and is very easy to implement at this point in time. Moving on, then we're going to look at land management, and as I've highlighted previously, we're going to try and make better use of our organic manures before the additional use of chemical fertilizers. There's no point in being very efficient in terms of nutrient use efficiency if our soils are not capable of growing our crops or grass as productively as possible. Ensuring that we have really good soil structure, avoiding compaction, optimizing our soil pH, and increasing our soil organic matter are all vital in terms of ensuring good soil health. Drainage of mineral soils is also vital, and this reduces the amount of nitrous oxide from waterlogged soils. With the announcement from the Minister, there will be the soil nutrient health scheme will be rolled out across Northern Ireland, and from that we will get more detailed information relating to our soil health of Northern Ireland and the opportunities that we have to make improvements. Other opportunities in terms of land management include increasing our length of grazing season. Now, this has to be done with the caveat that we are not going out to poach areas of land. Where poaching occurs, there's increased emissions from nitrous oxide. So increasing the grazing season in the shoulders of the season can increase or can reduce our carbon emissions, but must be done with care. And can also then lead to a reduction in the need for supplementary concentrates where weather allows. Livestock management then, in terms of making sure that our animals are performing efficiently and are productive throughout their lifetime, we need to maintain that they have good health. So having a very detailed animal health plan, looking at your farm specifically and the challenges that you have, the opportunity that you can to control those issues will ultimately improve your bottom line, both in terms of productivity and profitability, but also in terms of carbon emissions, as this will increase your carbon efficiency on farm. Opportunities to increase or optimize animal performance within your farm to include fertility rates, age at first calving being just 2 examples of this. Also, the use of sex semen, so we're reducing the number of, for example, dairy heifers on the farm. We're only producing the number that we actually need for replacements within our farm, and also then for selection of beef sires in for any of those animals that we don't need. The use of improved genetic selection. So there is a number of indices, including EnviroCow, which has been developed by HDB along with SRUC in terms of looking at the environmental benefit of specific sires, looking at the level of methane production and also feed efficiency, making up part of that genetic selection indice. There is a number of these indices also being developed elsewhere and will become more important as we go forward. Will be important to look at these alongside other existing indices, for example, PLIs, whenever selecting animals for replacement or breeding purposes. And then finally, targeted feeding. So ensuring that we are not oversupplying protein, because increased protein in the diet obviously is then excreted from the body. And this has an impact on both ammonia and nitrous oxide emissions. Plus, it is a major component of cost within an animal's diet. So again, highlighted many other benefits, including improved productivity and reduced cost of production on farm. Finally, energy management. Energy makes up a small proportion of our emissions, but it is a cost within our systems. And to implement any of these energy management strategies will have a very good impact in terms of cost reduction on farm, where these are not already in place. So simply insulating hot water systems to reduce losses of heat, the use of plate coolers to reduce the energy required for milk cooling systems, and then also the integration potentially of other heat recovery type systems to use the heat from milk for other purposes, for example, washing down the area of dairies, as an example. Other opportunities to increase energy efficiency include the use of LED lights, as we know they've come down in cost an awful lot over this past while, can very simply be installed where other lights become old and are no longer functional. Variable speed drives also can be used with 3-phase motors, and this will also help to extend the life of these products on the farm. Within building development, opportunities include cleaning skylights to increase natural light and reduce the need for artificial light during the winter months, but also in terms of not oversupplying skylights in new buildings. As we increase our warmer climates, there may be increased energy requirements in terms of ventilation systems. And only when all of these energy management and energy efficiency measures have been put in place, it is important then to look at renewables where appropriate. Not every farm will be suitable for renewable energies. Just a quick case study here in terms of figures, looking at opportunities to make potential emission reductions. So as an example, we have a farm here producing 956 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent. On this farm, we're using 166.9 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare with a calving percentage of 80%, calving at 26 months. Now, within this farm, we've detailed a number of measures that they made improvements on. So in terms of nutrient use efficiency, through the use of both the timing and type of application of organic manures, and potential inclusion of some legumes within the farm, we have reduced the fertiliser requirement here by about a third, increase the calving percentage to 90%, and optimise our calf at age of first calving to 24 months. Within this scenario, this has provided 44 tonnes of potential emission savings, almost 5%. Of these opportunities, these can be implemented relatively quickly and demonstrate the massive potential within our industry at this point in time to make emission reductions with improved efficiency across the dairy industry. So to highlight, following on from our final scenario there, we have opportunity within our sector at the minute to make emission reductions, but it's a small proportion in terms of where we need to be. There is an awful lot of research ongoing at this point in time, and I've just listed sort of the main ones and the ones that we feel within CAFRE will have the biggest impact on our industry going forward. The use of genomics and genomic type testing to produce animals that have reduced methane production microbiomes within their rumen, and also improve feed efficiency to reduce our methane produced during the digestion process. Feed additives, there's many feed additives available out there at the minute that have the opportunity to increase feed efficiency. They may have an opportunity as well to reduce emissions from our ruminant stock, and there is research ongoing looking at that, as well as specifically for feed additives to reduce emissions, specifically methane from ruminants alone. Slurry additives, so both additives to reduce the nitrous oxide during the application, but also additives to reduce the methane production during the storage period as well. Again, research is ongoing, and we are very much at the beginning of this journey, and it is probably expected that these will become more at the forefront in the next coming years. Renewables isn't a new technology, but the development and adoption will vary across our industry. And then finally, the use of hydrogen or electric vehicles to remove that carbon dioxide proportion from the fossil fuels that we burn directly on our farms has an opportunity, and there is manufacturers out there that will be releasing hydrogen agricultural vehicles in the very near future. So finally, just to summarise very quickly here, in terms of the greenhouse gas implementation plan, you will have noted many of these measures are related to improved efficiency, which ultimately leads to improved profitability and a reduction in carbon emissions. There are massive opportunities for new technologies to provide massive opportunity to reduce our emissions further than the opportunities we have currently within those greenhouse gas implementation strategies. So that concludes my presentation this evening, and Dawn, I think we're moving to a panel session now. Would that be correct?
That's right, Michaela. Thank you, and thanks very much for that presentation. It's taken us through those processes. You'll all be, as a panel, you'll be all be glad to know that we have a long list of questions. Normally with these events, you tend to have a quiet time, and then all the questions come at the end. Well, we've had a steady stream all the way through this, and we will do our best to get through them as best we can. I'll just basically take them from the top and work through them as best we can. Alethea, there's a question here. If methane keeps being measured the way it is now, then it will be difficult for dairy farms to get to net zero. Is there a difference between the circular methane the cows emit and the one-way methane that industry emits?
Yeah, I suppose I can't really answer that, to be honest. On I wouldn't be able to give a good answer for that one. Is there a difference between the? Sorry, could you repeat the question, Dawn? I just didn't hear the start of it there.
I suppose the implication here is that the methane emitted from a dairy cow is circular in the sense that she's eating grass that contains the methane. but it is that methane is still going into the atmosphere, I'm assuming.
Yes, it is still going into the atmosphere, and it is still being measured as part of the carbon footprint. Yes.
It's okay. Mike, the next question is more on milk marketing. With the environmental constraints limiting dairy herd growth in many regions of the world, can we expect that these controls will have an effect or an increase on milk price?
Well, certainly there are many factors that that influence milk price. It's a very simple equation, but it's multifactorial. So you have the demand side, and there's various factors that influence that. But obviously, on the supply side, which is what one of the main drivers that we're seeing at the minute of milk prices is on the supply side, where we're seeing in various countries around the world that milk production is not coming up to the expected levels. So certainly the supply side does have quite a significant effect on milk prices. So if we were to see that sort of scenario playing out, then possibly it could have an effect. But you do need to remember that in terms of the global market, it's maybe around about 8 or 9% of global milk production that's traded internationally. And you tend to have the bigger countries, the Australias, New Zealands, United States, EU, UK, that are the main players in that market. So those are the countries that are well developed in their mitigation strategies and being able to cope. So whether you see much impact in terms of their output remains to be seen, but it's a scenario that could play out. But there are a lot of factors that would have to come into play before you would see that as one of the main drivers of milk price.
Okay, Mike, thank you. And folks, we'll work through as best we can. So please don't really have to deliver the answer. Thank you for your reply there, Mike. In terms of Michaela, bubbler systems for slurry, have they any significant effect on emissions as a method of managing slurry that you're aware of?
There is research to suggest that, Dawn, and it is an area that I will be looking at going forward. There is obviously, historic bubbler systems, and there's obviously new systems, so we'll be looking at that in more detail. I'm not 100% sure what the benefit would be at this point, but it is important to note, for example, the calculators at this point in time would not take that into consideration as part of the calculation. So somebody who has a system like that may not be getting credit for it if it is shown to be beneficial.
That's okay. The other one then is there are a number of questions here on sequestration, and I will take some of the more specific ones, but in terms of general questions, yeah, we note the need to cover this as a topic, but when we were planning this, we were very clear that we couldn't cover this and emissions at the one time, so we do plan to come back to this as a separate topic. In terms of the next one, this is a fairly leading one in terms of Alethea. Why would a farmer bother planting trees to offset emissions if the land use section gets the credit for it and not the agriculture section? So is
there... Yeah. No, I suppose the way the inventory, they do measure it at a national scale, but hopefully in future it will, whenever we do measure on the ground, that will inform the inventory, and farmers will get recognised for that sequestration. They will get recognised for it anyway as part of the LCF sector, but there is a need to join up from farm level to the national level.
Okay, no, that's fine. Thank you. Mike, in terms of the collection of data or carbon footprints, do you see who will drive that going forward, drive that data collection? Will it become part of Red Tractor or quality assurance, or will retailers drive it through processors?
I think I mean, there's various talk about having a sort of an add-on to Red Tractor, but I don't think that will provide the level of detail of data that Michaela has outlined that will be required to for the carbon calculator. So I think we are going to have to look at this whole area of data capture, data storage, and data analysis and use. Because if we can get this right, and this was at the back of my mind when I was saying that if we're clever here, we can get competitive advantage. If we can do that data capture, analysis, etc., if we can do that better than anybody else, it's going to give us a very, very significant competitive advantage. Nobody else is doing it. But there is work that's going on to look and see how we might be able to do this in Northern Ireland, to be able to bring together the data from all the disparate sources that are out there, bring them all together so that we have the power of that knowledge hub that we can then start to use in terms of, for example, driving the research agenda, in terms of policy review, in terms of telling the story to our customers about Northern Ireland agri-food. So there's big benefit here if we can get it right, but there is work that's going on to look at how we might be able to do that.
Thanks, Mike. And then Alicia, Michaela, you can maybe decide who best to take this one. And this is the only one I'm going to sort of take through on the sequestering, but does grass or trees sequester more carbon? And I imagine that's on a per hectare or an area basis.
Yeah. Alicia, do you want to answer that one, or
Do you want to go ahead?
based on research at the minute done, for woodland, if you're talking about a woodland area, it would sequester more than an acre or hectare, the equivalent area of grassland, with slurry. Slurry application does increase sequestration compared to areas that don't get it, but not to the same extent as a well-managed area of woodland.
And is there a significant difference, Michaela?
Yes, there would be, and it depends then, I suppose, on the breakdown of the woodland area and establishment method, but generally, yes, there is a significant difference in sequestration.
That's fine. I will leave it at that for now. We'll hopefully get more figures and stuff at a later stage. That's okay. Alicia, as best you can, I understand that this might be a wee bit outside your area, but are all industries going to be measured in the same way? Agriculture, transport, heavy industry. We're talking here about the calculation for agriculture. Will similar measures be applied to those other industries?
I suppose I can't really answer that because I don't work in those other industries, but I know that they all will have climate action targets similar to the agricultural sector, and we will all have to meet those targets, but they should all be measured in some way, but I suppose I can't really inform you how that would happen, but I just know going forward all the sectors will have to take steps to reduce their emissions.
That's fine, thank you. Michaela, which type of floor bed is best for least carbon emissions, slatted, solid, or straw bedded?
Straw bedded systems have reduced emissions in terms of actual during storage, but obviously if you're unable to get straw on the farm and have to purchase it, then you're purchasing emissions associated with that. So on the balance, if you're able to produce straw on your farm, utilize the use of it within a straw bedded system, but also if you can't, slats are comparable in that instance. Again, obviously there is a lot of research out there depending on the floor, specifically looking at ammonia and nitrogen loss from that section. And again, calculators do not take that into consideration at this point. The main floor types are traditional slats and solid script floors for liquid slurry.
Okay, thank you. And this one is, do efficient high output indoor dairy systems have the potential to be more environmentally friendly than pasture-based systems? I think maybe that's a very wide question. Maybe in terms of the carbon calculator, is there a significant difference?
In terms of that specifically, no. There's no significant difference between pasture-based versus totally confined. There's more differences within systems than between the systems. So if somebody is very efficient in a totally confined situation versus somebody who's very efficient in a pasture-based system, they will have very comparable efficiency figures in terms of per kilogram of output or per kilogram of milk.
Yeah, and that's the basis of per kilogram of milk.
Yeah.
But I assume that there are slight differences between which are the big hitters in terms of the carbon emission sources, are they?
Yeah, so there will be, for obviously our confined systems, be an increased proportion of emissions from manure management, and for our pasture-based systems, there's generally an increased proportion of emissions from fertilizer because of the movement from that manure management sector in general.
Thank you. And this is another one for you, Michaela. Does ploughing in slurry and dung for crop production, such as whole crop or maize, reduce the emissions from that application?
There will be reduced emissions similar to the ammonia side of the house because there's less exposure to the air, there's less loss to the atmosphere. But within nitrous oxide, there is obviously the natural nitrogen cycle that we're adding to. So there is that natural denitrification process, which unfortunately we don't have any control over. So there is a limited benefit in terms of ploughing in slurries because obviously when we turn over our soil, we're releasing an awful lot of carbon that is stored in the soil whenever we expose that to air.
And this isn't in the question, but I'm sorry if it was an awkward one, but does injection then is that a better solution than ploughing?
It would be, yes, because you're applying that nutrient directly into the soil roots and you're not exposing any soil to air. You're closing it back over, but it's not, I suppose, something that's generally used here at this present moment in time.
Okay. Alicia, in terms of bought-in concentrate feed, what emissions are attributed to a farmer who buys in straights from a different country? Who's responsible for the emissions associated with that straight that's brought in?
Yeah, so purchased concentrates bought into the farm. The farmer will be responsible for those emissions. So they're called embedded emissions within the carbon footprint. And so the likes of the land use change, the manufacturing and production of that concentrate feed will be included in the carbon footprint. So yeah, the farmer will be responsible at this point in time, but it is it has been raised a number of times, and we have raised it with the AgriCalc regarding that, and they are looking into putting separate modules within the calculator to allow for the different feeds that are brought into the farm, or whether they're grown on farm as well. So yeah.
And you would expect that homegrown cereals then would have a lower footprint if they're grown on farm?
Yes, most definitely, and that's what we're wanting to get included in the calculator going forward.
That's great, and that answers yet another question that was in the list. The next one then is Michaela, on that slide you had on potential emission reductions, that one of the last ones there where you showed a reduction. I'm assuming that was assuming that the cow numbers would remain the same. There's someone here suggesting that all of that is based on reducing stock numbers on the farm, but that it isn't based on reducing milk and cows, it may be on heifers and so forth.
Yeah, so that scenario, we just assumed that there was an increased calving percentage, so assumed the same number of livestock on the farm. So it was actually just increasing the productivity and the time that those heifers, for example, came into the herd from being non-productive to being productive. So the number stayed static, so it's just that increased productivity to give us those benefits.
And in terms of the lower fertilizer applications, why were they lower? Does that mean there was less grass?
No, so we got that from our increased nutrient use efficiency. So by the timing of our application of both chemical and organic manures, and then also the method of application for our organic manures, we moved from splash blade to low emission slurry spreading, which gave us that increased utilisation of nitrogen from our slurries that we had on farm.
And was clover factored into that? Because there was somebody's asking here, was that based on legumes?
Yes, there was a proportion of clover. I don't have a figure specifically to that, but there was an assumption that clover would be included in some of those areas of grazing and silage.
That's okay. Right, I'm trying to interpret one of these questions. I'll move to another one. Yeah, this a wee bit way out there, Alethea, but we'll leave it with you on this one. As a senior technologist, in this age of space technology, can anything be done up there to dispel or at least reduce the heat retention of the emissions? So, and that's our question.
That is a NASA question. No, I definitely can't answer that. But yeah, I don't know. Maybe in future there could be some type of carbon capture coming out in future. But no, I am not aware of anything at the moment.
That's okay. And I mean, I'm going back to this very first question, which is, a couple of people have asked for a clarification in terms of this idea of circular methane on a dairy farm. Can you just clarify that? I mean, that methane that we're talking about being emitted from a dairy farm is going into the atmosphere, it's not being circulated within the ecosystem as such?
No, it's going back into the atmosphere.
Okay, that's all right. And that, folks, you'll be glad to know, takes us to the end. And there were a few other questions on sequestration in there, which I don't think it would be fair to take you to at this moment in time without having a chance to prepare, and it's something we will take through. One last one coming through there, and we'll take it. Just, and this one's for Mike, just to finish. Do you see greenhouse gas reductions being taken into account with future trade deals for agri-food?
Yeah, it's just a terrible pity the government hadn't been doing that in their discussions with Australia and New Zealand. You would hope that they will do, because it is extremely important that we don't have a situation where our farmers here are having to jump over very high bars, and yet they're having to compete with imported products that are not produced to the same sorts of standards. I mean, we were given reassurances by the government, UK government, at the start of this whole Brexit process, that whenever it came to free trade agreements, that they would make sure that there was a level playing field. And certainly that's not what we're seeing at the minute in terms of the negotiations that they're having with Australia and New Zealand. So it is a worry, and I see that Minister Poots has made his views on this very strongly and very well known to George Eustace in London. So I think it's something that we've got to really keep on, that hold, what's the phrase, hold the UK government's feet to the fire to make sure that they stay good to their word, that they're not going to allow lower quality, lower standard food products into the UK.
Mike, thank you. And folks, I'm going to close at that, although we have a few other questions there, but we've got through the majority of those and we are well beyond the hour at this stage. As I say, I'm also conscious about the questions of sequestration and uptake of carbon, and we will arrange future events. In practice, when we started to organise this about 3 or 4 months ago, we were a bit worried that with all the COP and so forth on at this moment in time, people will be sort of scundered. But I think there is a very clear interest in this whole idea of getting good scientific information on the topic, and we will try to meet that. I'd just also like to point out that there was a recent presentation Alethea did to the local COP26 conference based at CAFRE, and there was some more information there on the mitigation plans that CAFRE have implemented for its farm, and some more information on the carbon footprints of the CAFRE farms, and that's actually available on the Ulster Farmers Union website under the videos tab. So just remains for me to thank our speakers, Mike, Alethea and Michaela. I'd like to thank our technical team who've kept this event moving so smoothly, and thank you, the audience, for joining this event and asking so many very pertinent questions. Our next webinar in the series will be next Tuesday at 8 p.m. and in that one our topic will be managing and feeding for sustainability, and our speakers will be Neil Dyson, a dairy farmer from Buckinghamshire, who is an innovation farm for Ireland, UK, displaying the latest research ideas and developments to both customers and other farmers. And our second speaker is local vet Mark Little, a Nuffield scholar who will address the issue of feeding for health to combat antimicrobial resistance. So hopefully you'll be able to join us next week at the same time.